was your first fight like?
First fight was actually in the summer of 1998 in somewhere in East Richmond, which is a suburb of Vancouver. It was actually a bare knuckle fight because nobody wore gloves at the time, and it was an underground. By underground, I mean illegal fight. So to get to the fight as a spectator, you would have had to know someone who knew someone who was putting on the event, and you would have had to call a phone number and or a pager number. Actually, they would have to call you back and then give you the address on the day of, because they wanted to make sure that there was no police coming to shut it down ahead of time. So yeah, it was like that. It was in a ring in the middle of a warehouse. It was super hot because the doors were locked. Um, the dressing room was like a little tiny closet with a curtain, and that was actually both dressing rooms. That was for
Really?
both corners. Yeah, it was crazy.
You and your opponent?
Yeah, pretty much. He was behind the curtain,
Oh.
literally. It was like maybe two broom closets, like really small. There was a guy puking in the corner. The crowd was nothing but just, it was thugged out. It was like bikers, and there's some pretty notorious characters, especially if you're familiar with the street history of Vancouver. I remember the name Bindi Johal specifically being in the office.
Really?
Yeah. The police kept knocking on the door trying to see what was happening, and I remember the promoter barging in the room 2 or 3 times. The first time was, okay guys, if the police question you, we're filming a movie. 20 minutes later, if the police question you, we're filming, or no, it's a submission grappling event. And then eventually the police just came in and watched the whole show.
Oh.
And I ended up winning my fight, 15 seconds or something. It was pretty cool. It was one of Maurice Smith's students. So
How did the fight go?
I caught his low kick, fed him a big right hand, dropped him, took his back, rear naked choke. Classic jiu-jitsu win.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really one of your signature moves back in the day, catching the low kick and overhand righting.
You're right. You're
Yeah.
right. And you know what was funny? I almost never practiced it. It would just happen kind of on the fly as a reflex. I would not plan to catch the kick. It's more like as soon as the leg kick would land, my hand would drop to catch it, and the right hand would fly. It was crazy. Like I swear to God, I've probably practiced that move more after my fights because I wanted my students to do it. But myself as a fighter, I never practiced it. It would just happen on reflex.
Well, let's just geek out about that move a little bit. Then we got to get back in your history because it's fascinating. So, back in the day when we started, it was everybody knew that you never throw a head kick.
Right.
You never kick anybody in the head.
Yeah.
Because you're just gonna.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're just gonna get taken down. But everybody knew it was safe to kick people in the legs.
That's right.
But it turns out that there's actually kicking people in the legs can leave you open, and kicking people in the head is actually pretty effective sometimes.
Yeah, it's. I mean, the first grappler that got beat by a kick to the head was Conan Silveira, I believe, in Extreme Fighting. I mean, it just takes one person to do the move, and then everybody's on it. So pretty much anything works. Anything can work, basically.
So after your warehouse fight, your super sketchy warehouse fight, where it probably would have been easier to buy crack than it would have been to get an invite to this thing.
It was not in a sketchy neighborhood. It was in East Richmond. If you're familiar with Vancouver, it was just like a industrial area, really. But it was like, it was just a bunch of unsavory characters, and
So the cops are just wondering why every flagged license plate for 100 miles is all parked in this one parking lot.
Like, now that I think about it, how did they even know about it? Because it was it's not like it was advertised or there was people on the streets. It was so somebody must have snitched somewhere along the line. There you go.
Loose lips sink ships, but they didn't stop the fight. That wasn't the most sketchy MMA event going on at that time. Do you remember that there was out in the Fraser Valley, there was a
10 tumble.
Yes.
Why
don't you tell people about it?
Years before. Well, I saw the videotape. So that was a ring set up outdoors under like a tent, not a tent like you're going camping, more of a tarp propped up under posts, right? Like you'd have at a festival or something, right? But it was literally in some kind of field. So some of the guys fighting were fighting in just street shoes, because you got to remember this is 1997, so the spread of jiu-jitsu had not yet taken like it would later on, and people were just rolling all over, falling out of the ring into the mud, getting back in the ring, and fighting in their shoes, just dragging mud and dirt everywhere. I remember Caleb Starnes won that event because he just happened to have a little bit more jiu-jitsu, or just some jiu-jitsu, uh, you know, instead of having none. Yeah.
I remember the ref chasing a dog out of the ring.
What?
And I remember the ref almost getting into a fight with a member of the audience. Like the fight's going on behind him and somebody's beaking the ref, and the ref's like leaning over the rope. You come on in here, I'm going to kick your ass too. Like it couldn't have been more WWE
I
if they had.
I believe it. I don't think I've seen that part. I just saw some clips of it, but yeah, I remember it was pretty funny. Just the parts, just the fact that the ring was set up and it's just a dirt field. The sport's come a long way.
Yeah, just a little bit. So why don't we take you as, look at the evolution of the sport through your eyes, because you fought a lot in North America, Canada, the US, and you fought overseas a fair bit as well in an era when that wasn't at all very common.
Well, yeah, I mean, now it's actually a sport. It was not a sport back then. It didn't even have the name MMA or mixed martial arts. It was just extreme fighting, no rules fighting, or cage fighting. Oh, you do that cage fighting. There was not a structured set of rules like we have today, which is pretty much the same all over the world. There was no weight classes. The MMA gloves did not even exist. That came a couple years later with, I think, Tank Abbott and Mark Coleman, who were the first ones that I know to wear the gloves. Yeah, and then that's just the sport itself. Training.
There were events where they would wear the old Bruce Lee Game of Death gloves.
Well, when I first moved to American Top Team, those are the gloves we were wearing to spar, the Bruce Lee Jeet Kune Do gloves. They would call them ninja gloves. It's pretty funny. Yeah. But yeah, no, back then the sport was just very raw, and then just training for it was hard because nobody knew how to train properly for a sport that had not been invented but a couple of years before. So you had to. For me, I used to read as many fighter interviews as possible, just in case the reporter would ask Tito Ortiz or Frank Shamrock, "What's your training schedule?" And they would go into some kind of detail. And
they always just said the same thing. Oh, I bike, I swim.
Yeah. I
how
remember
often?
Some of them lying, saying they train 8 hours a day. And I was like, whoa, I got to do that. And I tried doing it once. I tried training 3 times a day. Sprints in the morning, jiu-jitsu in the afternoon, kickboxing at night. I think I had to take like a week off after. It was just way too much. So they were, I don't know, they were just lying into the interview to make it seem like they were training harder than they really were, obviously.
How did you train for MMA initially? Like your very first fight, what did you do to get ready for that?
I mean, basically just took off the gi top, worked takedowns because I needed to train to take people down and shoot in under punches and hit the bag and do a little bit of sparring. Because the first time I sparred for real, I realized how bad I was and how scary it was. And honestly, I didn't want to do too much more of it. I'm like, no, I got to be a grappler because this is way too. Because I was sparring.
Way more stand-up sparring.
Yeah, remember Shamrock Pollock, right? He was way more advanced than me. He was a kickboxing champion, so he was just playing with me, and I felt like I was so lost. It just made me realize how much I needed to learn, in terms of striking. But yeah, just take off the gi top, do takedowns, hit the bag. That's it. Maybe run a little bit. Yeah, that's all I knew, right? Only much later, that I really start to compartmentalize my training, get different coaches, and really take a professional approach to it.
In my mind, anyway, there's kind of different eras, and let me know if you think I'm off base. But initially, most MMA guys came either just from the straight out of prison, and I'm a tough guy, so I can fight, or they came from a single martial art after a short while. It was mostly jiu-jitsu guys.
You're right. And I'll even add one more. And especially in regards to UFC in those days, most of the guys taking part were a little bit older, like late 20s, early 30s, or in their 40s even. There was no young guy. The first young guy was Jerry Bollander because he was 21. Yeah. And then after that was was Vito. So for somebody like me, I was like 18, 19. I didn't even think that I really could go to the UFC back then because everybody was a martial arts master, so to speak, right? So when I saw somebody like Jerry Bolander and Vitor, it was like, wow, I can do this. They're my age. It felt like really something like I had a much deeper connection to the sport. I was like, it just, man, I can't explain how I felt, but it was really something like it really touched me when I saw somebody my age. It really showed me that I could do it also.
Maybe youth and athleticism and an open mind count for something.
Right. And I mean, now, of course, you have people training from like almost since being born, right?
Yeah.
And but back then, yeah, it was not like that at all.
I think initially, anyway, most of the fighters I associated with, they had one teacher. They might cross train, they might spar, they might do a tiny little bit, but there was this idea that you would mostly train with your jiu-jitsu coach, and he'd be responsible for everything.
Right.
And then the next evolution was kind of you'd have a conditioning coach and a jiu-jitsu coach and a striking coach, but you do everything separately. There was not really anyone trying to figure out how to mix it. And then only later, and this took quite a while, did those barriers break down. You had somebody, no, I'm an MMA coach, and I teach kind of the grappling combined with the wrestling, combined with the striking.
Right.
And you might still go to a specialist, a wrestler if you need to work on your body lock takedowns. But there was a period when you would train very purely. You would train pure jiu-jitsu or pure kickboxing, and then kind of hope it magically came together in the ring.
That's right. I mean, I think I'm going to go and assume here, but I consider myself probably the first or second generation of like full MMA coaches who know a little bit of everything and have fought. Because like you said before, it didn't exist. How could you have a coach in MMA when the sport was so new? I mean, I'm sure there were some, right? Like maybe the Ken Shamrocks or the people who had been there from the very beginning.
Carlson Gracie, maybe.
Oh, Carlson, yeah, Carlson. Actually, you're
Senior.
right. So it would have had to be somebody special like that who had a rare glimpse into the world of fighting, of NHB or MMA fighting. But other than that, you had to get a specialist. And I'll tell you one thing. It was really hard to have separate coaches for everything because each coach thought that they were or wanted to be your main coach and wanted to get the best out of you. So sometimes you would show up to your second session of the day and you've already had a crazy session in the morning, but this coach in the evening, he doesn't care because he hasn't seen you in a bit and he wants to show you that he can train you just as hard, or he wants to be the one, So yeah, it was a little bit hard. Nowadays, like for example, this team that I have here that I'm doing at Pinnacle here, I'm their main coach. They have little things that they go to get extra help here and there, but they can get everything in-house if they want to. Right?
How much of that jealousy was coaches getting the 15 or 20% commission of the purse for training you? Because that's how it worked.
I'm sure that was, I don't know, everybody was a little bit different because that's not set in stone, but I'm sure there was a little bit of that also. I think it's just human nature. You're training someone, you want to get the best out of them, right? Yeah. But I'm sure that probably did throw, some weird vibes into some training camps.
In terms of timeline, when did you start fighting in Asia?
I had my first fight in Japan in 2000, September 2000. Yeah.
Okay. So, what was that like?
That was incredible. I mean, it was September 2000. I had just finished spending the entire summer in Brazil training at the Carlson Academy. And then all of a sudden, I get this lady named Phyllis Lee, who's passed away now, but she was the fight booker for Pancrase. And she tells me, hey, pack your bags, kiddo. You're going to Japan. Cool. Who am I fighting? Minoru Suzuki. Oh, wow. He was one of the founders of Pancrase and one of the luminaries, if I can say, of the sport in that organization. I mean, the guy had fought Ken Shamrock, Bas Rutten, Frank Shamrock, you name it. Anybody who was a star from that era of Japanese MMA, he had fought. And I was also a big fan of him, so I had to train for him. And it was the Japanese were notorious for calling you a little bit last minute. right? So there was that also. I didn't have that much time to prepare.
How much
So
time did you have?
I I don't remember exactly, but no more than a month, if that. Yeah, because I had come back from Brazil at the end of August, and this fight was at the end or mid September. It was right after my birthday. So yeah, it was like the last week of September. It would be.
Well, maybe give people a background of what Pancrase was, because it was MMA, but it was pretty weird MMA, at least initially.
You're right. Yeah, it was. So Pancrase originally was palm strikes to the head, punches to the body, and on the ground, same thing with submissions. So you had a big focus on the submissions because it was hard to knock someone out with palm strikes until Boz Rutan came, and that's a whole other separate story. But yeah, it was very submission and grappling based, and you had a rope escape back in the day. So if you got caught in a submission, instead of tapping, you could grab the ropes, and it was like you could get free, but you only had 5 rope escapes, and once you grabbed it 5 times, you lost automatically. But by the time that I was fighting, they were making the transition over the full MMA because that was what the whole world was doing, and it was full MMA, like it was punching and kicking on the ground. Except that if you wanted to kick, you had to wear shin guards, and I did not want to wear shin guards and shoes because they didn't want to get leg locked because the Japanese were notorious for their leg locks at the time. So I chose not to wear shin guards, so that meant that I could not kick. So yeah, so I was just boxing and jiu-jitsu. And I fought Minoru Suzuki. It was incredible. I beat him by TKO or KO. I think it was a TKO in the first round. And it was quite the experience. It was incredible. I could not believe, here I was, 22 years old, and I'm just standing across the ring in Japan from Suzuki. Like, oh my God. Pinch me, because I thought I was dreaming.
How were your nerves, or was it mostly
Not
excitement?
so bad, to be honest. Not so bad. The next fight, my nerves were much worse. Yeah, in that fight they were not too bad. I think I was just so excited, maybe too young to really realize what I was getting into. I don't know, but yeah, I was pretty good for this fight.
How much time did you have to acclimatize? Because I remember the Japanese were also notorious for like flying you over, and then 2 days later you'd be fighting with 14 hours of jet lag.
That's right. So you would get there about 3 or 4 days before. Like if I was fighting on Saturday, I would leave probably on the Tuesday. So that meant I would get there late Wednesday night, you know? So, or maybe even on Thursday sometimes because you lose a day going forward. So, yeah. And yeah, the jet lag was so bad. 16-hour difference, 16-hour ahead.
I remember looking it up, and it's very roughly an hour per time zone that you fly across that you need to recover till you're back to full athletic performance.
1 day per time zone. Is that what it is? Or 1 day per hour. I can't remember. Yeah, I remember you telling me.
It's a bloody long time. You didn't have 2 weeks to get ready.
No, not at all. A couple of days.
And then that set off quite a bit of fighting in Asia.
It did. So that was in September. Just a couple of months later, in December, so right around Christmas time, they called me for another fight. Again, very short notice. To fight the champion of that weight class at the time, Kei Yamamiya, who was a badass, who was super tough, had fought in UFC already, or was going to fight later. No, I think he had fought in UFC back in the day against Eugene Jackson, actually. Yeah, that's right. And yeah, it was on 3-4 weeks notice. And I remember that time I didn't have a lot of money, so I wanted to buy Christmas presents for my girlfriend, my friends, family. So I was working a part-time or full-time in security. So it was really hard to train. They called me on 2-3 weeks. Of course I take it. Fly over there with Marcus. And I fought. I lost a decision, but it was the first time that I'd gone to a decision. And it was such a rush. I remember it was probably one of the hardest things I'd done at the time because I felt like my lungs were going to blow up. And also what's funny is they gave an overtime. So it was one 10-minute round, the fight was, and the ref says overtime. And I remember as soon as the 10-minute round ended, I thought, oh, thank God. I'm so tired. And then the ref comes up to me and goes, overtime. I'm like, oh, no. I looked at Marcus. I go, Marcus, I'm dead. I can't do this. He goes, man, what can I do? You got to fight. Get out there. And then, man, I put down my head and started swinging. And yeah, that's it. I didn't give up though, so I learned a big lesson. I learned a lot about myself that night, and like I said, later after the fight in the locker room, I just felt such a rush of adrenaline and just so much. I don't know. There was just a big rush in having fought a decision. Something was different, yeah, because it was different than having the fight finished before the time limit.
So you had one of the longest undefeated streaks in MMA history. Not the longest, but definitely top 5, I think. You had 22 fights undefeated. That you were really, really on top of your game. What kept you going, and how did you manage to, like, clearly you were doing something right. What were you doing right?
Well, there was a couple different things. I mean, if you look at my record, you'll see that I was actually, before that streak, I was on a bit of a skid. I think I had 2 or 3 in a row that I had lost. So I had to really dig deep and find a way. Like, after the last fight, so before my streak, after the last fight that I lost before that, I had quit in my head. I thought that I was no good at this sport and I was never going to get anywhere. I was wasting my time. But I had already signed for my next fight. So I had an obligation to fight contractually. And I was like, I might as well make a bit of money. And if I lose, I lose. I'm going to be the MMA loser. I don't even care if I win anymore. Who cares? And because of that not caring attitude, that's how I started to win. I was not nervous at all. I was super chilled. I won the fight pretty fast. I carried it on through the next fight, which was in Boston, I think, against Keith Raquel. And that year, I just kept going and going. I think I went 6-1 that year. And I fought a couple tournaments, too. So a couple of those fights, that was in 2003. A couple of those fights were in one night. And it just kind of kept going from there all the way until whenever that streak ended. And yeah, it was, a lot of it was because of my mental approach to it. I stopped putting so much emphasis on not losing or not losing and trying to win, and instead just focusing on the training and on fighting well and not making a mistake. And if I win or lose at the end, whatever. But at least I'm going to stay calm and try to fight hard with as few mistakes as possible. And yeah, it changed a lot of things. And also, I think I was just starting to hit my stride in terms of getting experience, finding different coaches, really getting into the groove of knowing what a good training camp was like, and bringing myself to peak shape before a fight. Because remember, like we discussed earlier, nobody taught me anything, because nobody around me knew, because this like very few people had done a full training camp for a fight, so I had to kind of put it together, ad hoc, so to speak. So yeah.
So what was the ad hoc Denis Kang training camp like? I mean, I'm sure it's evolved now, but how long was it, and what would your day look like?
I mean, go to the boxing gym and try to get the coach to take me seriously, and maybe hold pads for me. If not, hit the bag, and maybe spar, so I don't feel like I got ripped off for paying the drop-in fee. Or go to the wrestling club at SFU, and try to go as hard as I can so that I'm not too embarrassed because they beat me up so bad, and then maybe they want me back because at least I fought hard. And that one actually worked, because they did like me over there, because I would show up. And even though they would go pretty hard on me, I would just keep going and going and take everything they could throw at me, because I was young at the time, right? So I was pretty resilient. Yeah, so just, mixing match, doing wrestling here, boxing here, doing jiu-jitsu with Marcus, of course. Really, though, when everything came together was when I started to get a strength and conditioning coach. A coach by the name of Tracy Fass. She was coaching in Vancouver at the time, and it really it just kind of tied everything together, I think. It really brought, like, I was already a pretty athletic kid, I think, but I think having the strength and conditioning pushing me a little bit more just kind of took me to the next level.
How did it take things to the next level and tie things together, and not just simply grind you into the dust even more if you're already doing 2-a-days on most days?
Yeah, well, remember, I was learning a little bit more about periodization, and if I was doing 2-a-days, I wasn't doing every session super hard, right?
So I guess that was actually an evolution, not having to go balls out on
Right,
every
exactly.
single training session.
Exactly. And I was starting to see myself as a professional athlete also because the sport was, I was growing with the sport basically, right? I was not just seeing myself as just some guy who's trying to do no holds barred. I was seeing myself as a professional athlete trying to succeed in the sport of mixed martial arts. I was seeing myself in the same view as like a professional baseball player. I was trying to take everything just as seriously.
So what does that mean in reality, to take yourself, to treat yourself like a professional, to look at
Make
yourself
it
as
the
a professional?
priority, right? Make it the priority in your life. Don't cut corners. No excuses. Like, this is what you do. That's it. If something is in the way, I don't do it, or I go around it and I still do it, right? If someone or something is stopping me from training, I cut it out. I go, the training was my only focus, and I had to get it done. I had to get it, right? That was extremely important. Nothing mattered to me except the training. As long as I could train, I was happy. I knew that. Regardless of relationship, if I didn't have a car at the time, if I had very, very little money, as long as I could train, I was okay. So, yeah.
I know that after when you ended up moving to Montreal to train again, there was a strength and conditioning guy who was kind of I don't know if cornerstone is the right word, but a guy who connected all the dots, the linchpin of your success.
Yeah, that's right. No, so that was in Montreal. John Chamberg was a big part of my training back then. I mean, he was really that was the first time that I was, because I had strength and conditioning coaches before, obviously, like I mentioned, but he took things to a little bit of a higher level. Like, he had a big like education background in sports science, and he was big with the plyometrics and just periodization with strength training and stuff like that. I don't remember exactly what we were doing, but I remember it was, yeah, it was good. It was good. Yeah, that was the first time that I had jumped hurdles. I remember it was really cool. He also had some pretty innovative ways to train. I remember.
For example,
One thing was he had he this rope pulling apparatus. So it's the machine or the mechanism. It's called the trainer, and it's supposed to be for sprinters. And you're supposed to be able to run tied to a rope, and it gives you resistance. So you're pulling the rope. But what he done instead, and he tied two big long like battle ropes to them, and you could just endlessly pull the ropes. Go to the other one. I think when you came to train, you might have seen me do it. I can't remember. Yeah, it was awesome. Yeah, he trained with his mentor was this guy named Stuart McGill, who's like a pretty famous guy in sports science. You've probably heard of him.
he's been
That,
on my podcast.
oh, really?
He's changed the way that I lift weights.
Oh,
He's
really?
changed the way I look at
Wow,
back
I
health.
didn't know that. I didn't know that. Wow, I
Yeah.
apologize. Yeah, I didn't know. But yeah, no, he's a big. I don't know if he was a student of Stuart McGill, but he brought him over a couple times,
No.
and he did some testing on myself and GSP, and I can't remember who else was there at the time. Yeah.
So you were also down in American Top Team back in the very early days when it was quite different. Could you talk about the early days of ATT?
Yeah, that was so. I moved down there in 2004. Yeah, at the time, American Top Team. I mean, it was called American Top Team, but it was like 80% Brazilians. It was very jiu-jitsu based. It was a big, everybody. There was like, I think, 15 black belts on the team. Yeah, and it was not as advanced as it was now, obviously, but it was still a little bit more advanced than most teams. It was really the first team where you could get everything under one roof, and the athletes were like getting a little bit of a salary and resources by the team.
Didn't you get a car initially
No, I
in the
never
early
got a
days?
car. No, I never. I
Oh,
had my own car already. But some of the guys had cars to share. They were given cars to share by the team. Nothing fancy, but enough to get them. Because in Florida, everything's big. It's like California. You got to
yeah.
drive to get anywhere. So you needed a car down there.
So, but it's pretty high level coaching that they brought in.
Yeah, it
Didn't they?
was. There
Who
was.
did they bring in for wrestling? Was it Daryl Golar? Am I making that up?
No, they didn't have Daryl Gorlar. When I was down there, they didn't really. They had this guy named Jason Kelly as a wrestling coach, but the wrestling was not at the forefront of the training back then. Yeah,
Okay.
the Daryl Gorlar, you're thinking of Brazilian top team.
Oh, as
Yeah,
opposed to American
he
top
was
team.
down there. He was on
You're
the
right.
because you're thinking of the Day of the Zen documentary.
Yeah.
See how well I know my MMA history. But anyways, no, we didn't have. Actually, when I came down there, I was a little bit of a wrestling coach for them because I had done a little bit of wrestling in high school and a little bit at SFU, as I mentioned. So I just to Brazilians who all they'd done was jujitsu. It was like they thought that I was this crazy wrestler, which I wasn't. But I just knew how to shoot a double leg. So yeah, and it was pretty funny. But yeah, anyway, so yeah, their wrestling back then was a little bit more judo based, I would say, because they came from jiu-jitsu, and then there was a couple American members who had wrestling as a background, so they could teach them. But yeah.
And was it an American top team that you ended up fighting in the Grand Prix?
Yes, yeah.
Maybe set the stage. Maybe explain to people what this was
Okay,
at
so
the
this
time.
was the Pride Grand Prix. So Pride, instead of doing regular title fights, they would take
I think
basically.
there's been enough time that we need to explain what being in Pride means, Dennis.
Yeah, well, Pride was the biggest event in the world at the time, and they had a separate division called Pride Bushido, just as big, which is where they had the weight class that I was in, which is called which they called welterweight, which is 83 kilos, which is 182.6, which was hard to make, but it was still a good weight class for me. I felt like I was big. Yeah, and so instead of having a regular title fight, they would take their top 8 fighters and have an 8-man tournament spread out over 3 or 4 events. So basically over like 4 or 5 months. So you would fight once, and then you would kind of like a pyramid, single elimination, just fight the next person 2 or 3 months later, and then the finals of the tournaments was it was one 4-man tournament in one night. So you had to fight 2 people in one night for the finals. So that was in this November or October 2006.
Yeah,
It was a good
yeah,
event.
yeah. I mean, but you were doing amazingly well in the tournament. I mean, you clearly made it you made it to the finals.
Yeah, it was good.
But
Remember, it was a hard time for me because I'd had a tragedy happen just before uh, with my fiance killing herself, Shelby Walker, which obviously took me and everybody around me by surprise. She was a part of the team, so I had to recover from that. It literally happened in September, and I had to fight in early November, I believe, in Japan. So it was hard, but I had to rally together. I had to go to the funeral. I had to do all these things to deal with that, but train at the same time because like pulling out of the tournament was not an option. I had to do it. I had to stay on it.
so, I mean, how did you? It's not just a suicide of someone around you; it's a suicide of your fiance. So
Yeah,
that's incredibly heavy.
right.
Um, how did you manage to uh,
Like I'll,
deal
I'll
with
tell
that?
you. I'll tell you one thing. It happened on a weekend around on a Saturday, and on Saturday Sunday, and I was back in the gym on Monday. I just had to because but I remember driving to the gym and I just had to pull over and cry and call someone because I didn't know if I could handle it. It was hard. But I made it to the gym and I trained because there was no way I was going to stay at home and just you know wallow in pity and just like I had to do something to kind of deal with it, to process it really, and go into the gym, sparring. I remember everybody as I walked in the gym, everybody was looking at me because they're like, "Wow, he's coming in." Like everybody knew what happened. It was a pretty sad and weird time at the gym, but we did the training, and you know the people at American Top Team helped me a lot training with it. Like I stutter as I say this because it's really something that touched me very deeply. But they really rallied together in supporting me and making sure when they saw that I was keeping going and keeping training, they were like, "Well, we gotta that's our boy right there. We got to help him out.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I had a lot of support. I remember people came down to help me from Vancouver.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder to what extent it's the training is dealing with it, and to what extent the training is saying, okay, I'm going to delay dealing with this, because I know, like, dealing with deaths in my own family, there's been that both of those things have been true. Sometimes I've just wanted to push, like, fuck, I can't deal with this right now. I'm just going to immerse myself in something else, maybe even addictively, to just allow the worst of this grief to pass, and then it ends up popping up later, but maybe not as strongly, or maybe not in as incredibly bad a time.
Right.
So
Well, I mean, it was you know, uh, of course, nobody really gets used to dealing with something like this, but it was the first time that I'd ever dealt with this kind of tragedy. So I mean, it's the only thing I knew how to do was just train. So
yeah.
yeah,
So then, how did the finals go?
the
Like a month
finals.
and a half after
So
the
I won the first fight against a guy named Akihiro Gono. I won a
who
decision.
was a legend, who
Yeah,
was an
he was
absolute
tough. He
legend.
was tough. Yeah, and I ended up tearing my bicep in that fight, and I ended up fighting anyways. Coming back to fight, I was supposed to fight against Paulo Filho. He hurt his knee, but he chose to pull out, and I ended up fighting the guy that he had fought. This guy named Kazuo Mizaki, and I lost the decision to him. Very close decision, but I mean, it is what it is. And I can honestly say that was a very hard fight, because just the fact that it was the second fight of the night. So I'd already fought a full fight. Fight went to a decision, so I was already pretty tired. And I had that torn bicep, which was bugging my shoulder and my arm. So
I was clearly not unbiased watching that fight, but
yeah.
in my eyes, and pretty much everyone else who watched it, they thought that you should have won that decision. But you're
I
fighting in
think that the
Japan,
Japanese
hometown
really
advantage.
wanted. If you look at the tournament, there was like two Japanese in there at the finals, right? Gono and Filio, and then
Not
so
Filio.
Mizaki and Gono, sorry, and then Mizaki lost, but they had an alternate fight. They had, I think, Lombard and Musashi fight for the alternate fight. So why not give the the birth to an alternate? No, instead they bring back somebody who's lost already. How does, like, I've never seen that in a tournament
Mm.
unless they don't have an alternate. But they had an alternate, right? That doesn't make any tournament sense to me.
No.
Like, yeah,
Well, I, it was early days, and
yeah,
it's not like the UFC is exempt from
you're right. You're right.
accusations of diddling the divisions to get the fight that they want. Or,
Yeah.
I mean, I think the
Are you
most
saying I
egregious.
diddled? Come on.
I'm not saying that you did anything in the UFC when you fought there, but I'm saying if we go back, uh, Brock Lesnar, for example, Brock Lesnar probably should have been fighting for the heavyweight title on
Right.
his third MMA fight ever.
Or Anderson Silva getting a title fight after beating Chris Lieben, right?
Yeah.
Like, wow.
So, I mean, yeah, all these organizations
Yeah.
they have audiences to please.
I mean, to be fair, Anderson Silva was worthy of being the champ at least, right? But Brock Lesnar, yeah, you know, yeah.
So you're one of the generation that actually fought tournaments, in the sense of fighting multiple fights
Oh yeah.
on
I
one night.
fought up to 3 fights in one night, right? I fought 2 fights in one night, 3 fights in one night. Yeah.
What's that like?
It's different. It's very different. I was actually thinking about it the other day. Like, very few people will know what it's like now because they just don't have them anymore. There's too much risk of the fighters getting injured. Like, so you fight, you win your fight, you got to go backstage. You can't really calm down and relax too much because you're going to have to go again, right? So you got to stay warm, but not so much that you'll lose energy and burn out in between rounds,
Hmm.
right? So it's a hard thing to manage, right? And of course injuries happen because tournaments are rough. Like, one fight is enough. It's hard enough as it is. 2 fights, 3 fights, bumps and bruises, you know. Maybe that bump and bruise that you got in the first fight, it's gonna get hit again in the second fight. and the third fight is gonna get hit again. Like, talk about adding insult to injury, or adding injury to injury. Like, oh man.
So if you were coaching somebody who was going to have 3 fights in a night, I don't know, some crazy Russian production or something, um, some underground MMA fight in Myanmar, uh, how would you coach them differently? Like, how would you?
I would first of all, I would get them in better shape than usual, better like long fitness shape, and then unfortunately, the nature of tournaments is like very long, so I would tell them to take it slow in the first round. And that's why people don't have too many tournaments, because the first fights are usually pretty boring, because people want to save their energy for the later fights. Usually,
Understandably,
you're right. You're right. Understandably, right? I mean, it's not a soccer match; it's a fight, right? So yeah, I would tell them to fight slower in the first round and open up as you go along in the later fights, right? And then bring some stuff for in between to keep your mind focused. And yeah, that's it.
so you were teaching during your fighting career, and people have talked about how difficult that is because essentially, if you're competing, you have to be selfish. You have to prioritize yourself. But if you're teaching, you have to prioritize your students. So how did you manage to square that circle and do both at the same time?
Well, I was using, I was, at the time I was only teaching jujitsu, no-gi jujitsu, and I was using it myself as my own practice, right? So my class, I would teach it, and I would also spar and roll with my students quite a bit. So it worked out really well, because my students would get a really high-level training partner, and, I would get to kind of set the example, literally, right? So it worked out well, yeah. Yeah. It would have been different if I was training twice a day and still had to teach a lot, But this was just 2 or 3 times a week.
You've come up, you fought for a long time, and then you slowly stopped fighting. You've seen lots of other people, that you trained with and people you competed against have to make the decision to stop fighting at some point. What's that like? I imagine that's so much part of your identity and also your revenue flow that it must be a tough transition.
It is. It is. Like it's when you've done something for so long, and it actually becomes a part of who you are. You start to see yourself as a fighter, as a soldier, a gym rat, whatever, and it's when you it starts to that when the window starts to close on your time in the fight world, sometimes it starts to scare you, because you're like, what am I gonna do? Not like I was lucky. I always had a natural affinity for teaching, and I always liked teaching. But some people just don't like it. It's just not who they are. So I don't know. That's where you see people staying in for too long, right? But you have to have an honest conversation with yourself. If you're already questioning whether you should stay in, or whether you're still good enough, and you're probably pretty close. Okay, number one. Number two, this is one of my best friends, Bill Mahood, gave me this advice when I had stopped fighting. He said, you have to remember that fighting is something that you do. It's not who you are, right? You can stop competing but still train, right? But you have to accept that, turn the page, and start the transition into a different part of your life. Don't be that guy who stays in there and tries to hang on for that one last fight and is fighting for just a payday, right? I'll tell you one thing. I've only had one fight that I took for the money and I didn't train that much, and that was my last fight. And I lost. 2012. I fought Melvin Manhoff. I took the fight a little bit short notice. Didn't train that much. Was kind of burnt out, And fight didn't go very well, but I didn't care, And then I ended up calling it quits after that, anyways. Right? So.
I think that's probably one of the things that I've seen a number of times is fighters who early in their career can't wait to train, and then later in their career they've kind of lost a love of training. They may still be fighting, but they've lost a love of training,
Exactly.
And they're like, "Oh fuck, I've got to fight in 6 weeks. I guess I better start doing some road work."
That's
Man, you can't make up for a year of partying with 6 weeks of road work.
That's it. Like I used to see it. I used to feel so lucky because I remember being a teenager, my favorite thing in high school was PE class. I hated school, but I loved gym class. To me, being a full-time fighter was like gym class every day. Like, I loved it. It was not a job. I loved it. I was first one to leave, first one to stay, first one to get there, last one to leave. And then I remember at TriStar, I'm in Montreal when I finished my career. The last year, I would show up outside the gym, and before going in, I would sit in my car for 20, 30 minutes, just motivating myself. Like, oh, I don't want to go in there. And a couple times, I just turned around and left. And I remember on that drive leaving the gym, feeling so relieved. Oh, thank God I'm not doing it today. Man, like, in hindsight is 2020, of course. Like, now that I see, like, somebody should have pulled me aside and told me to stop, but I didn't really tell anybody. Um, but I should have told myself to stop, obviously,
or take a break at the very least.
Yeah, exactly, right. But it's all I knew how to do. I was just, you got blinders on because you're so deep in the sport, right?
Yeah. Why do you think you had that sort of, call it reluctance to, or what, that loss of enthusiasm about training? I imagine that chronic injuries must have played part of that.
It's a combination of things, and you're right. Injuries do play a part in it because now it was just harder to train because now training hurts, right? I had to pay for it physically. Another thing was because of the injuries. See, you got to remember, I always was always the fastest, most explosive guy,
Yeah.
and I had
Can confirm.
Huh?
Can confirm.
Yeah, right. So, and when I started, that was not enough after a while, and you know what? One of the the milestones, or not the milestones, the key moments was when Rory McDonald came to the gym, and he was only 21 or 22, I think, and he was so good, and I was like, oh my God, like, this is. I should not be having. A guy this young should not be giving me this hard of a time, And this is a compliment to Rory. This is not to take anything away from him, But and instead, and it kind of put a little bit of pressure on me, but it just kind of made me not enjoy training anymore, because I knew that my body was not the same anymore. I would get injured more often. My body was starting to not be able to hold up, The tendons, the bones, the muscles just couldn't take the strain of training. Like, these injuries were happening more and more now, So, yeah.
Have you had to take other fighters aside and give them the talk that you should have given yourself?
Not a little bit, but because I don't know, it seems like there's a little bit more knowledge and communication in the sport now. But I've had to talk with fighters who were coming to me for advice, and I told them the same thing. The question. I'm not going to name the fighter because he's actually a fighter that's close to me today that coaches with me, but literally he said, "What do you think? Like, I'm not really enjoying the sport anymore. Should I still fight though? Because I think I can still fight." I said, "Man, this is not a basketball game. This is like training for a fight. People throwing punches at you. You have to be 110% in it. You can't be 75% in, even 90% in. Like, this sport has serious repercussions, right?
Do or do not Daniel San.
That's right.
There is no try.
Maybe. There's no I'm going to try, right? Yeah.
How do you find? Obviously, you're still coaching, and how do you find that? Is it replicate any part of the thrill of fighting?
Oh, big time! I love it. I'm in the gym every day, and I'm still involved with the sports. I put everything I have into this group of fighters that I have right now, and yeah, man, we have a really good team. Um, we do really well on the local circuit here. Hopefully, I'll be able to bring them a little bit further. If not, that's okay. I still do my best and try to take them as far as they will let me.
Contrast like a typical day in a fighter 20 years ago and a typical day for a fighter now. What's different? A well-trained fighter.
Yeah, well, nowadays, like back then, you would do maybe more jogging and strength and conditioning, because the strength and conditioning was kind of on like when I say strength and conditioning, I mean like cardio routines, kind of like CrossFit bike on that circuits, which I feel that my fighters do almost none of that now, and they never get tired. Instead, we do a lot more sparring and drilling, so they get comfortable with doing the sport that they're going to actually compete in. You know, they don't try to build a stamina base by doing a different sport or just with just raw fitness. You know, because this sport is different than any other sport because well, any combat sport really. Combat sports are different than any other sport because you have the stress factor involved, right? Like people don't really get nervous when they're about to play a soccer match or a basketball game. But boxing, kickboxing, MMA, even jiu-jitsu, there's nerves. Maybe less in grappling sports. I don't want to put down grappling or BJJ, but MMA is freaking intense, man. I imagine boxing, kickboxing too, at a high level because you know in advance that you're going to do this fight. People are asking you about it. Everybody knows you're doing interviews. Your opponent's talking crap. There's a lot of things that go into it. So it's your your brain can be your worst enemy, right? Just with the thoughts that go through your head about the fight. So you have to keep that in check. So today, I would say that the training is more efficient. There's less time wasted doing raw power training and a lot more focus on technique and drilling and precise training to build the skill base, which will make them more efficient and in turn a better athlete for fighting. Not a better, not a better just athlete overall, right? Which I find that there was a lot of time wasted back in the day doing a lot of conditioning circuits, which maybe not wasted, but too much, right? Which, in my opinion, strength and conditioning should be for building attributes, which is what I was doing, like with Chamber, building a lot of power, a lot of a lot of strength, tools that will help you with the fighting, you know, and let the cardio or the fitness develop, you know, with the sparring and the drilling.
So you'd say there's a role for, like, I don't know, deadlifts, bench, squat,
100%.
and weighted pull-ups in the
Absolutely.
modern fighting environment?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. You should be strong and fast and, you know, be able to go for a long time, right?
I think there's a seasons of life thing there as well. I know that when I did weightlifting as a young punk in my 20s and 30s, I wanted to be strong so that my martial arts would be better.
Right.
Now I'm doing weightlifting and strength training so that I can keep on training martial arts.
That's right.
It's call it prehab,
Yeah.
rehab,
Just to be healthier, right?
you
Yeah.
know, uh,
That's right.
and so I don't think that a squat simulates very much of what you're going to be doing in a real fight,
No.
but it loads the body axially, and it increases bone density. It
Right.
builds that
You
strength. It
build
builds
that
a certain
strength that you need, especially from the legs, right?
yeah.
You need that leg strength, driving from the foot, you know.
So, what advice would you have for somebody who's 15 years old, 16 years old, thinking about fighting MMA? Like, what do you wish somebody had taken you aside and told you?
Build a strong wrestling and jiu-jitsu base and don't take too many hits or don't take any heavy hits until you're 17, 18, 19, right? Don't leave your best sparring days in the gym when you're you know when you're young, right? Save that for later on when your brain is fully developed. So, yeah.
So that's a minimization of brain trauma.
Right.
Do you think that there's a certain number of hits that each person can take, and then they're done? Like you hear about some people who are you know have granite shins, and then all of a sudden one day anything knocks them out. Chuck Liddell was an example of that. He could brawl with the best of them, and then there came a day when he got knocked out. Was it Rich Franklin? Punched him in the face
Oh,
with his broken arm.
there was a few, but
Yeah.
I don't think there's a certain number of hits, but a certain number of hard hits and
Mm,
like hits that actually cause you to lose consciousness
mm,
or cause you to, you know, get very shaky. I think
A
it's
concussion, in other words.
right, concussions basically. I think your central nervous system. I think the more it happens. I think when your body goes unconscious, I think it's almost like your body doesn't want you to be standing or taking any more of this trauma, so it just makes you drop. Maybe in the hope that you won't have to take anymore. So maybe it takes so much that it kind of, because your body's very smart, man. Like your body's almost like a computer and it learns things, right? It may sound funny to hear that, but it's true. You know that. Like that's why your body gets stronger and bigger muscles when you lift, because it learns that you're giving it progressively heavier loads. It's the same thing with taking hits. You take more hits, it's going to maybe do the opposite of get stronger, and it's going to get weaker and drop you because it doesn't want you to take those hits. I don't know. It's interesting, right? But I think there is definitely a mental aspect to it. To somebody who has never really experienced any kind of like rough house play or rough impact, with someone who's had rough impact and done something kind of impact-ish and who takes a hit, they're going to be able to react a little bit better, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's just mental toughening.
You're right. That's
And
it.
and
Yeah.
some people are born mentally tougher. It doesn't mean that you
Yeah.
can't become mentally tougher, but
That's
some
right.
people drop out of the womb and they're, you know, badass mofos.
Yeah.
Uh, Whether or not they make it into adulthood, that's an entirely different question. Yeah, they're found dead behind a bar somewhere. From people dying behind bars to uh, people who want to train with you or talk to you or find out more about you. How do they do that?
On Instagram, so I'll list my social media on Instagram at this is Denis Kang, and that's actually the main way. I'm also on Facebook and on X. X is just Denis Kang. Teach in Vancouver, Richmond, BC. Uh, I'm the head coach at this gym called Pinnacle MMA, and I teach MMA, no-gi jiu-jitsu, and there is boxing, kickboxing. We do all kinds of training here. We try to make it so that it's competition level training without having to compete if you don't want to, and without having to feel like you're going to get beat up, right? So it's still very, very, we try to keep it as cutting edge as possible with still being, good old bread and butter, simple techniques, but still remain, with up to date with what's happening in the world of MMA, but still accessible to everybody, right? We take MMA very seriously here. I try to set the culture here so that it's hard, technical, fun training for everyone. It doesn't matter if you don't have a background in any sports, if you're overweight, if we will take you in and we will make you a better martial artist, a better fighter, a better version of you. And if you want to fight, we will do that too.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time, Denis, and best of luck with your teaching and training.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Stephan.